From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Do you have a problem looking at your phone every few minutes, mindlessly refreshing Instagram, X, TikTok, Snapchat, anything, just checking for messages even when, let's be honest, no one is sending you any? Our James Marriott has taken a stand.
So, at the beginning of last year, my best friend from university got married and I was his best man. And on the morning of the wedding, I had to make my way to his house by myself. Something that should be quite simple because he's my best friend and it's his house. He had moved somewhat recently, but I should know the way. And I got off at Walthamstow Station in North London and began to walk in the direction that I believed his house was. And I suddenly thought, I do not have a clue where I'm going, and had no means of finding out which direction I was going in. So I had to ring my girlfriend, ask her to look up the directions for me on her computer and speak them down the phone to me, having tried to identify by explaining to her my surroundings where exactly in Walthamstow I was. And then she managed to direct me to my friend's house, and I did not miss his wedding. But it was a hairy episode.
Which normally would have been resolved by just getting your phone out and going on maps.
Yeah, but that would be the problem, because this was, I think, only a couple of weeks after I ditched my smartphone. It was an early lesson in the fact that it's not always an easy life.
A year ago, James gave up his smartphone and switched it for a so-called dumb phone, a brick phone, if you will. And what started as a month-long experiment for a feature has turned into a whole year. And despite those navigational issues, he says it's been a silent bliss, free from the ping of notifications. The story today: can you live without a smartphone?
My name is James Marriott, and I'm an opinion columnist at The Times.
Do you mind me asking how old you are?
I'm 32 years old.
Got you. So you are sort of in the territory of someone who, when you first got a phone, it was maybe a brick phone, and then grew up with smartphones as they were invented and expanded upon.
Yes, I think I probably got my first smartphone at university. I was a little bit behind my peers, but not by a huge amount.
Why was that?
Because I think I've always been, I'm a huge skeptic of technology now. I think that was always latent in my personality. And I remember being a bit skeptical of people with phones, even at the age of 17, which was sort of before the age of ubiquitous smartphones.
Yes, but for all your skepticism, did you quickly find yourself just falling in with the fold and becoming a manic scroller?
I think I did, although I think in hindsight, it wasn't instant. I don't think it was the case, and I'm sure this is the case for a lot of people. It's not that I immediately got an iPhone and then became addicted to it. I think over a couple of years, I realized it was taking up more and more of my time. I remember having things like Snapchat at university. I think just the stuff that you can do on a phone has proliferated in the, probably 10 years since I first got a smartphone. Probably more than that.
And for you, that included what?
For me, I mean, this is terrible. And this is a real journalist thing, is Twitter. People are tweeting about you, often not very nice things about you, which is somehow even more addictive than knowing that people are tweeting nice things about you. You're tweeting, you're seeing who's liked your posts. I guess for other people, this might be Instagram, but for journalists, it's Twitter. Prolific Googler, prolific user of Wikipedia, endlessly distracted by thoughts that I should look things up. WhatsApp, very bad. Lots of WhatsApp group chats.
So group chats, not even you communicating with somebody, but just the
sort of mindless ping of people who I mean, no offense to anybody with whom I'm in a WhatsApp group chat.
But we know the types.
People you don't always feel like you're 100% keen to hear from. And I mean, my real shame was my addiction to the Tetris app, which took up an awful lot of time during my commute. Slightly
vintage. I wasn't expecting that. And were you aware, a year plus ago, that this was a problem? Were you, as you were doing it, thinking, I need to stop this, this isn't healthy?
Yes, I've always felt that way. And I think it's partly maybe due to my slightly distractible personality, partly due to being a journalist and having your whole career on your phone. I was probably unusually bad for this. I think I was easily capable of spending 3 or 4 hours a day on my phone.
But the vibe you give off in the page of the Times is somebody, lounging on a chaise longue all day reading fabulous niche books.
I know, that's part of the vibe. And I think this was actually what sort of was upsetting about it, because I thought of myself, and had been since I was a kid, somebody who read a lot of books, somebody who spent their whole time reading books. That's sort of a big part of who I feel I am. And I was sort of like, why am I letting this part of my personality be taken away by the endless distraction of my smartphone?
But maybe not in the book aspect, but in the having your time robbed by a phone aspect, you are maybe comfortingly, at that time, you were bang on average. Sort of in the amount of time you're on the phone, the amount of us actually consumed by these devices, it's a modern widespread problem.
Yes, and I think actually the average amount of time a person spends on their smartphone, I think, is about 4 hours. I suspect for my generation it's a bit more. I certainly know that for Gen Z, I think average screen time is 7 hours and above per day, which is an awful lot.
Some of us aren't awake 7 hours a day, so that is impressive. And in your some of your writing as well, I read that a third of teenagers say they use social media almost constantly, which, if Gen Z are doing on average 7 hours a day in front of a screen, there must be people in that who are doing 8, 9, 10, 11.
Yeah, sure. And there are also estimates of average phone time use that are much higher. I mean, I think it's pretty hard to measure effectively, but yeah, I think I've seen things saying the average might be like 12 hours or something, really quite high.
I would contend it's not just a young person problem, though. Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. And I think for a while we talked about it as if it was, but I think it affects a lot of people.
Did you try any management techniques before you binned the phone?
Yes, lots. An iPhone gives you an opportunity to allegedly limit the amount of time you spend in an app. You can allow yourself to have an hour on Twitter or an hour on the internet every day. But all you have to do is press a button that says, give me another 15 minutes, which is very easy to do. I had another app. As long as you didn't touch your phone, as long as you left your phone untouched, it would grow a little animated tree on the screen of your phone. And to preserve the beauty of this little animated tree that was growing, you had to not touch your phone. But that was not much of an inducement.
When did you decide to actually then get rid of it then? How did that decision come about?
I think it had been a decision that I'd been making on and off for probably a year before I finally did it. There was an added inducement for me that I was writing columns in the Times talking about how...
So everything is copy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it was the fear of hypocrisy that I was writing columns in the Times talking about, the dangerous effect that smartphones and social media have had on our politics, the effects they're having on intelligence, our ability to concentrate, the negative effects they're having on our mental health. And I was writing all these columns about how awful smartphones were. And it began to really feel like, in that case, why do I still have a smartphone? Nobody, some people were, but I was unusually well appraised of the dangers of them. I'd gone around telling a lot of people how awful they were. And I think it was sort of time to stick by my own principles. And actually, if I was telling everyone they're so bad, I should get rid of mine.
So what was the plan then?
So the first plan, which I always knew would never really last, but I thought was useful as an experiment, was to go totally cold turkey and get a really old style Nokia phone. I think it was a Nokia 105 that just did calls and texts and the app Snake. And that was pretty much the extent of what it did.
I was going to ask. But Snake, you can lose an hour at least, but yeah,
and
not
I did.
7 hours.
And I did.
So how long did you stick with that Nokia brick phone, as we might call it?
I did that for a month for a Times feature. And that was the incident where I got lost trying to get to my friend's wedding. And that really does feel like going back in time. I remember sitting in my bedroom with my Nokia phone with a sudden, almost eerie sense that nobody could contact me. Nobody could WhatsApp me. I sort of found myself picking it up, wanting to do something with it, wanting to Google something on it, wanting to listen to music, but it was just giving nothing back to me. It was almost eerie. I realized that I was in a sort of state of disconnection that reminded me of being a teenager. I hadn't felt as disconnected from the world since I was 17 and sitting in my bedroom. And that was a very interesting experience. I would have loved to have stayed with that phone, but I think, even I, a sort of anti-smartphone campaigner, have to some degree live in the modern world. I can't never be contacted by my friends or my employer. So
but they could SMS you.
That's true. Although, this is maybe a bit of a side note, but smartphones have really changed the way that people communicate, even via text. So people will send you on a smartphone a string of messages, expecting them to appear in order on one screen where you can look through and it's like a conversation. But on my really old style Nokia, these things came in, you could only view one message at a time. It was very hard to work out what order they come in. And people don't communicate as if they're writing on Nokia phones anymore. And of course, the fiddly little keys, trying to respond properly to people who are typing on proper, smartphone keyboards and sending you long, coherent messages. And you're pressing the sort of number 9 4 times to get one letter out of it. That was also quite unsustainable.
Did you, in that first month of cold turkey, as well as the anxiety of disconnect that you explained, did any kind of freedom wash over you? I mean, was there any element of bliss that you got from it, that you were actually not slave to some device?
Yeah, it was brilliant. It was an overwhelmingly positive experience. The comparison I always make is that when I had my smartphone, I always felt a bit like a kid at school. When you're in a classroom and you want to chat to your friends, and you're just about to get into a really interesting conversation with your friends, and the teacher suddenly says, no, pay attention. And I felt like my smartphone was my teacher, and I was always trying to go off and do something, and it was always yanking my attention back, and is never quite able to do the things that I wanted to do. It was like being let out of school early, was how I kept saying, which sort of sounds silly or ridiculous, but it's the only way I can think of to describe that feeling of freedom that I got out of it.
So you did that month with the really, really dumb phone, the brick phone. And then what did you do after that?
So after that, it's a slightly complicated story.
Did you relapse?
I didn't relapse, but going smartphone free isn't totally easy. There are answers. There are various dumb phones that provide you with a pretty good midway point where you have something that maybe looks a bit like an old-fashioned Nokia, but it maybe has WhatsApp, it maybe has music on. For a while, I had a Nokia that had WhatsApp and a radio station, so I listened to a lot of the radio instead of Spotify. Some of them stopped working for me. Other times, various operating systems were discontinued. But if you dig around on the internet, there's a very good community on Reddit, the internet forum of people using dumb phones, and all kinds of suggestions for phones that you can have that provide a kind of useful midway point where you maybe get WhatsApp so your colleagues can text you.
Yes.
Or you have Spotify so you can listen to music, but you don't have the sort of endless stream of distractions that a smartphone gives you. And I think this is a good midway point, because this is more what a lot of people, I think, would like their phones to be, which is a tool that you're in charge of, that you can use, not something that's in charge of you that is manipulating your attention.
So your current tool, to look at it, I'm going to say that's not a brand I recognise, James, to be frank. But what is it?
So this is the F23 Pro, which is a phone made by a company I think called Duoquin, which is a Chinese company, and I had to buy it on a website called AliExpress, which I suspect may not be an adventure that all Times readers will necessarily want to go on, ordering technology from China. And perhaps the Chinese government, as people constantly say to me, is listening to this.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure they're eager listeners to the story as well. But there are loads of options. There's for a while I had a great phone, the Cat S22 Flip, it was called, made by the construction company. That's great. There are options out there if you want to do it. It's
Cat,
just
as in the people who do sort of tools and utility trousers.
Yes, they make phones technically for workmen. So they're kind of big, robust, old-fashioned phones with big keys.
Like a plasterer's radio, but a phone.
Yeah, and it will have a couple of the useful apps on.
Yes.
There are various ways to do it.
So your current phone has on it what?
I've got WhatsApp and Spotify.
And that's pretty much it in terms of the modern world.
That's it, yeah.
Maps?
And that's enough.
Maps?
I think I could have maps in it if I wanted, but I've survived without it. And I'm trying to be a little true to the pioneering spirit of smartphone-free life.
James, you've been talking us through your dumb phone, slightly smarter than some of the dumb phones that are out there, but your quest basically to decouple yourself from the ravishes of smartphones, which we, I think, all suffer from these days. It is something that has been around for a while, I feel, but actually the iPhone was invented in what? The mid-2000s? So it is a sort of relatively recent-ish issue.
Yes, and I think we're still in the early stages of getting a handle on what it's doing to our minds, what it's doing to society. And in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of interesting books on the subject, some more research about it. In my view, none of it is good, what we're learning about what smartphones do to us. But I think we're past the phase where this just seemed like another new technology, relatively innocent, new devices come along all the time. I think there are a lot of negative effects from smartphones in society. And it's just about now that we're really beginning to understand through studies, through research, what they're doing to us.
And on that societal level, what is it that's so concerning? Because Luke Jones not reading as many books a year as he would like to is not going to cause civilization to fall. So what is it that is more societal that concerns you?
Yeah, I do get that. I mean, I think the obvious point, which has been written about a lot, is what this endless, constant connectivity is doing to our politics. And I think an awful lot of the political disruption we've seen in the last 10 years is due to the effect of tech companies and the way that we know they manipulate our attention and our behavior to become enraged, because that makes us stay on their apps, that makes us see more ads. And I think that's a pretty acknowledged story. Not everybody is using their phone like that. Some of the stuff that's really interested me recently has been the effects we've learned about that phones have on people emotionally and on people's intelligence. So there was a book that came out last year, The Anxious Generation, by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, who's been quite pioneering about the emotional effects of smartphones. And
to really drill home the point, I have bought that book last year, but have yet to get around to reading it.
I mean, Jonathan Haidt would have expected nothing less.
Such is the issue, but yeah.
And he has all kinds of, I mean, really convincing statistics that all these metrics for teen mental health just fall off a cliff after about the year 2010.
Suppose you're born in the year 2000. You are 7 when the iPhone comes out. You got a front-facing camera in 2010. You are 11 when you probably got one. You got on Instagram when you were 12. So when you hit puberty, you're going through puberty not meeting up with your friends. You're going through puberty, swiping, tapping, liking, and hanging on. What if I post something? How will people react? Half of our kids say they're on the internet almost all the time. 50%. Almost all the time. This is not a normal human childhood. There's not as much face-to-face contact. You don't get to develop social skills. You don't have hobbies. You don't read books. You're just on your phone all day long. And guess what? Their mental health collapsed, especially for the girls.
So we're really finding out that this trend of people being alone on their phones by themselves rather than socializing is very damaging for mental health. The other story, which I think is still emerging, which I think there's less of a consensus around, is what smartphones are doing to intelligence and IQ, and the way that being constantly distracted by a phone and endlessly watching or reading what I think is quite well referred to as brain rot. It was the OECD word of the year last year, this kind of proliferation of trivial, trashy content on our phones, short form TikTok videos, memes, all this stuff, which I think seems relatively innocent if you spend, half an hour scrolling your phone. It's quite fun. But the cumulative effect of what that does to us cognitively, I think we're beginning to understand that that's quite bad.
But some of it can feel enriching is the problem. I remember the other day reading some long Twitter thread about, Haussmann's plans for Paris as it was rebuilt, which was fascinating. I can't remember anything about it. I've listened to multiple episodes of The Rest is History on the Congo. I cannot remember any of it. So on the surface, it seems really improving and enriching, but it is actually taking the place of proper depth of knowledge.
I never want to be too prescriptive about it or too black and white about it. I'm not saying everything you do on your phone is wrong.
Yeah.
I would be very slow to criticize The Rest is History, which I love. But I think the fact is the kinds of content you're fed on your phone, that replacing proper long-form concentrated reading, which took up a huge amount of people's leisure time actually until quite recently. People reading long books, people reading long newspaper articles, which we're obviously very in favor of. Removing those things from your life and replacing it with lots of short-form videos, I think does have quite deleterious cognitive effects. There was a really interesting study which found literacy rates declining among adults across the developed world, which is quite an extraordinary thing because literacy rates are something that's basically improved constantly year on year since they've been measured. And the idea that these things should decline in developed countries is really quite remarkable. That's a really odd thing to happen. And a lot of people think that's smartphones.
Have you found a tribe who have also had this epiphany? I mean, you mentioned that Reddit where people were discussing dumb phones, but are you in touch now with other people? I mean, I don't know how, faxes maybe, but with people who have also got rid of their smartphone and are benefiting from it.
Yeah, I've come across a couple of people, some of whom are a bit more hardcore than me, I have to say. I know a guy Nick, who I bumped into in a cafe actually and noticed that he had an old-fashioned phone, which is obviously a reason to get talking, who's totally disconnected himself from smartphones and is one step further than, I mean, you might say many steps further than me, in that all he has is the ability to text and the ability to call. And he's been doing that for a couple of years. And yeah, I mean, is a great evangelist for it. And I like to think, I certainly feel like I speak to a lot of people who are at least keen to get rid of their smartphones. And I always like to think that maybe I could get a little bit of a movement. There's been a big movement about getting kids off smartphones. And I kind of wonder whether there could maybe be the same thing for adults. Because I think all the stuff that smartphones are doing to kids, they're doing to adults as well.
Well, because some of the discourse around, as I say, I haven't quite had time to read it yet because of the phone, the Jonathan Haidt book, but some of the discourse around that when that came out last year was suggesting that this generation of young people we have at the moment are sort of an experiment. And there are people older who, weren't exposed to Instagram at the age of 13. And then in a few years' time, there'll be 13-year-olds for whom we've had the revelation that we shouldn't be allowing them to do this. And moving up through the ages will be this sort of 10-year cohort of people who had this experiment on them, really, where they had access to all these smartphones and bits and bobs. Do you think the same will be for our generation, me and you, and maybe older people who went through their working lives in early adulthood with smartphones as a sort of experiment, and the people who come after us will have had the realization that that is not wise?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm not super optimistic about the idea that there'll be any kind of mass movement to get people off smartphones, or that in a particularly widespread way, all teenagers will have their smartphones taken off them. I think that'd be very hard to achieve politically. But having smartphones as we had probably in our early adulthood, I think is less damaging. I think Jonathan Haidt would say this than having it in adolescence, because, I mean, so many of the problems he talks about are due to all the kinds of social vulnerabilities that adolescents have. I mean, especially teenage girls, anxieties about being left out, bullying online, the need to feel constantly connected and the need to feel constantly like you're in every WhatsApp group and on every Instagram thing and all this sort of terrible body image stuff. I think a lot of the depression comes from that. And I think we're a bit less socially vulnerable as we get older. Our brains are fully developed and we're not, running whatever strange experiments with endless brain rot on developing brains. If you're an adult, I think if you're our age, you've grown up at least with the experience and the expectation that something you do as a grown-up is you sit down and read every so often. So yeah, I think it'll be a bit less bad for us. I'm very interested to see how it works out in the future, but I'm not optimistic.
So you don't think you're at the crest of some amazing trend?
No, I mean, I'd love to believe that's the crest of it. I don't think I've ever been at the crest of an amazing trend. I mean, it sounds like a lovely thing to be able to do. I do get a lot of pushback from people who think that the answer is just to delete your social media and have a bit more self-control. There will be always people who think that. I think they're wrong. I think it's designed to steal your attention. But I do hope there'll be a bit of a movement of people who, realize it's a problem and want to get their lives back a little bit.
So you're 1 year down, and this is, the future now?
I hope so. I mean, one of the problems is that it's becoming harder and harder to function in our society without a smartphone. More and more things are going onto apps, things like train tickets, boarding passes for planes, which I've caused a lot of frustration with, attempting to get through boarding gates without a smartphone. I wonder how long it's going to be sustainable. Things like passports, maybe eventually that'll become an app. And part of the reason I was keen to do it sooner rather than later was the thought that who knows if in 5 or 10 years' time this will be an option.
Times columnist James Marriott. You will find his weekly column on Tuesdays and his podcast reviews on Saturdays in the Times newspaper or at thetimes.com if you have a subscription. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Will Rowe, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.